So as I've been preparing for today, I've had a photograph on my desk. I'm sure you're going to be relieved that I'm not going to start a kind of where are they now kind of conversation, although that might be quite fun and illuminating. If my memory serves me correctly, this photograph was taken at the BSA Sociology of Religion Study Group postgraduate conference at Burwell's, and I think the year was 1998. I'm not quite sure how I came by the photo, but the fact that I found it safely stored inside Jim Beckford's book on social theory and religion is probably suggestive of its origins. It was definitely a time when Sylvie and I were probably a little less wearied by ref-obsessed universities, administrative burdens, and absolutely dependent still on the support and encouragement of a lot of the founding members of the study group, so Jim and Grace, Mike Hornsby-Smith and others. Stumbling across this photograph in preparation for today gave me pause for thought. I began to reflect on who was missing, not only in the picture but also within the wider constituency of sociologists and sociologists of religion in particular at the time. In the last 17 years or so, we've seen a new generation within the field of what we might call British Muslim studies start to make a very significant contribution to the broader social scientific study of religion. The conference programme in this 40th anniversary year, the evident Muslim religious identity of some of our speakers, provides evidence enough that the landscape of our field has changed rapidly within a relatively short space of time. The religious diversity of wider society that sociologists have painstakingly mapped in the last 3 or 4 decades is now reflected right here in this conference hall. And I think that's a really important and welcome development. So I want to use this paper as an opportunity to try to answer the question of how the study of British Muslims is potentially serving as a springboard for new discussions within the sociology of religion more broadly, illuminating perhaps possibilities for new approaches to fieldwork and research methods, and possibly new theories also. So my paper is in 3 unequal parts. In the first part, I'll be briefly looking back on the development of our knowledge and understanding of Muslims in Britain and the methods by which this knowledge has been generated. So this is a short but necessary retrospective glance in order that I can then situate the second and more substantial part of my paper, which tries to highlight the work of a new generation of researchers, some of whom are developing insights about Islam as a result of finely grained ethnographies, and in some cases ethnographies of their own mosques, Islamic religious associations and localities. I want to suggest that the relatively new involvement of British Muslim social scientists in particular is highlighting some important lessons in terms of social scientific method and fieldwork practice and to some extent theory. Having unpacked some of their contributions, in the third part of my talk I want to explore how their work might nuance some of the ideas that are prevalent in the field at the moment. So let's begin then with a brief retrospective glance at the development of knowledge about Muslims in Britain in the recent past. When I wrote my textbook, Muslims in Britain, an introduction, I was aiming to synthesise about 30 years of quantitative and qualitative research. I couldn't have written it without the outputs arising from some early pioneering research centres and projects established in the 1970s and 80s. I'm thinking of the work arising from the Community Religions Project at the University of Leeds, and the insights that we might derive about mosques and imams from the work of people like Stephen Barton and Ron Jeeves. I'm sure these dust jackets are familiar to those of you working in this field. The Centre for the Study of Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations at the University of Birmingham will always be associated with the pioneering leadership and scholarship of Professor Johan Nielsen. And this centre was really the catalyst for mapping the efforts of Muslims to establish mosques, schools, burial facilities, and so on. Of critical importance back then was the production of the British Muslims Monthly Survey, which was a sort of monthly newsletter that used to come to members. And prior to the internet, this was a really vital source of information for researchers in the field, because really they were trying to capture local and national press coverage about Islam. I also have to mention the foundation of the Muslims in Britain Research Network at Birmingham, which in its early days, in the late 80s and early 90s, provided a context for researchers to share their work and to network with one another. But in contrast to the MBRN of today, back then, a good number of our members were from churches and church-related organisations such as the Church Missionary Society. These organisations were concerned to engage with the implications of new Muslim settlement in Anglican parishes up and down the land. So researchers like Philip Lewis were typical of this important constituency within the academic field at the time. Research traditions which had their intellectual origins in the study of Islam in Muslim majority societies began to shift their focus to the settlement of Muslims in Europe in the late 1980s. And so via the work of anthropologists such as Alison Shaw and Penina Vergner, we began to gain an understanding of the migration process, intergenerational and transnational relationships within Muslim families living in Britain. As part of this retrospective evaluation of the field, we can't ignore either the outputs of researchers at the Centre for Research in Ethnic Relations at Warwick University. Mohammed Anwar, for example, was one of the first Muslim sociologists in Britain to do some quantitative mapping of Muslims in Britain based on extrapolation from data about race and ethnicity in the census. While more qualitatively, the contribution of Tariq Madood, especially in the immediate aftermath of the Rushdie affair, provided insights on questions about identity, belonging, leadership, the representation of Muslims in the public sphere. This was all important foundational scholarship, in some cases detailed and localised, in other cases more broad brush, but necessarily reflecting the time in which it was produced. In one form or another, it was inevitably concerned with questions of settlement and institution building. I couldn't have written my own textbook without reference to this important body of literature and the communities of scholarship associated with it. But who was missing from this community of scholarship, and what has changed since that time? Well, relatively few of the more anthropological or ethnographic studies back then were undertaken by those who claimed a Muslim identity. And there was virtually no reflection on fieldwork practice or questions of reflexivity and positionality. These terms were only really starting to enter broader anthropological discourse, so this omission is not especially surprising. Few of the classic works about Muslims in Britain back in the 1980s and 1990s carried any real detail about the fieldwork process or the way that field notes were made or analysed. There was typically no reference to any kind of formal ethical approval, and the role of the researcher in the production of knowledge was barely considered. And perhaps perhaps because of their relative accessibility and availability, there were a good number of studies about Muslim young people and women. The field of British Muslim studies back then was somewhat skewed by the straightforward availability of people to be surveyed or interviewed, and the existence, or not, and willingness of organisations, or not, to provide spokesmen, and they were men, on subjects that were of interest to aspiring academics. So, from this rather general picture of how things were then, where are we now? I want to move into the second part of my paper by referring to the work of a scholar who, for me, signalled an important new phase in the development of what we might call British Muslim studies. The outputs arising from a professional doctorate in education which focused on the dynamics of a Quran memorisation class in Redbridge in London in the early 2000s have become required reading year after year for the students at Cardiff who are doing our MA on Islam in Contemporary Britain. Dr. Bill Gent, a retired education advisor for the London Borough of Redbridge, conducted a particularly sensitive, carefully documented, reflective ethnographic study in a Muslim setting. And in this case, it was a Hifz class in a Deobandi mosque in Redbridge. His own background as an educationalist and doctoral student, combined with the quality of the relationships that he was able to forge, led to a series of articles and papers that not only carried some very profound insights about the process of memorising the Quran, but documented the way in which he navigated relationships and positioned himself physically, socially, professionally, and in more personal ways with those that he encountered. Most crucially, he was able to build bridges between different educational and pedagogical worlds. The result being an appreciation of the spiritual, educational and personal value of memorisation, rather than its dismissal as an outdated method of teaching and learning. It was Gent's ability to tack between different educational worldviews and to signal the potential mutuality between them that made his work a point at which we could discern some important currents of change in terms of research about Muslims in Britain and the methods by which it might be undertaken. Since Gent's study, I've come to value the work of another experienced educationalist who, like Gent, is using a doctoral programme as a vehicle to give academic grounding to professional experience and insight. Farah Ahmed is the head teacher of a Muslim school in London, and she came to my attention when I read her paper a few years ago on the use of halakha instead of a more conventional focus group as the data collection method for her PhD. I subsequently invited her to give a public lecture at the Islam UK Centre in Cardiff. A halakha is a spiritual circle time that was instituted at the time of the Prophet Muhammad for the educational and spiritual well-being of Muslims. It's conducted purely orally, with students and teachers sitting together, and can involve student or teacher-led discussion. It can be collaborative and sufficiently free-flowing to enable the shape and direction of the conversation to change as it continues. The space given to Islamic worldviews distinguishes the halakha from the conventional focus group, as does the emphasis in halakha on the potential for personal development and communal transformation. It goes beyond simply gathering data. It was clear from Ahmed's work that the use of a halakha as a research method enabled participants to refer to and draw on their Islamic worldview for their discussions, thus becoming a form of indigenous knowledge generation. Participants were not treated as complex material subjects or merely as social scientific actors, but as individuals who can potentially acquire insights at a spiritual level. As Ahmed notes, and I quote, the use of halakha as a research method may be viewed as a challenge to dominant academic and social norms, where Muslim communities are natives to be studied by the enlightened scientific academy of the metropole. In using the more familiar Islamic term halakha with her participants, her approach to data collection was underpinned by what she regarded as a participative, collaborative, dialogic, and spiritually reflexive conversation with autoethnography. What I valued about her work was her bold and confident decision to write about her adaptation of tried and tested methods of qualitative data collection, in this case a focus group, and appropriate them in ways that she regarded as more appropriate for the context of her research with fellow Muslim teachers and mothers at the school. She took ownership of the qualitative methods toolkit and did something new. She argued that the principles that underpin halakha allowed the multiple identities of the teachers at the school to find expression as mothers, as Muslims, as teachers, thereby enabling an understanding of the school to emerge that reflected its holistic ethos. As opposed to simply gathering information via a focus group, the form, the process, and the objectives of the halakha were directed towards individual reflection and communal transformation. Her work signalled the way in which the religious identity and worldview of the researcher could be actively engaged in the process of data collection in a way that had academic, personal, and for her, spiritual integrity. In this way, she demonstrated that our methodological tools might sometimes need to be hammered out into new shapes, and that as the forms and expression of religion change and develop over time, so too our research methods might need to change and evolve as well. And rather like Bill Gent's work, once again we can see Farah Ahmed engaged in bridge building, in this case between different philosophies and assumptions about research methodology and fieldwork practice. For me then, the really exciting social scientific work going on in the field of British Muslim studies is when I read the insights of those who bring to their professional and personal, when they bring personal and professional experience into their work and build connections between different ideas, different practices, different worldviews to generate something completely new. Staying with the theme of halakas, but taking a change of direction towards quantitative methods, the work of one of my current PhD students at Cardiff anticipates a time when social scientists with an interest in surveys about religion might need to take a hard look at some of their assumptions. Asma Khan, a name you might be familiar with as the co-author with me and other Cardiff colleagues of Muslim childhood, is now engaged in a mixed methods PhD about the economic inactivity of Muslim women in Britain. At this point, I'm going to own up to total statistical and numeric illiteracy and utter reliance on Asma's co-supervisor with me, Professor Ralph Fevre from the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff, for his understanding not only of quantitative methods but also the sociology of employment and labour markets. Now, prior to undertaking the quantitative phase of her work, Asma has undertaken detailed quantitative analysis generated through her own original statistical models of the Ethnic Minority British Election Survey, or MBES for short. Being an experienced researcher with British Muslim communities, Asma has uncovered some significant shortcomings of this large and no doubt very expensive survey. For example, in order to measure aspects of social capital, the MBES survey asked respondents about things like their participation in clubs, their take-up of hobbies, the associations they belong to, and their frequency of attendance at places of worship. So where would a halakha, held in a private home, a school or a mosque fit within these categories. It's not a club, it's not a hobby, it's not an association, and it's a bit of a stretch to regard it as communal worship in the sense implied in the survey. My contention is that if ASMA had been involved in the survey design, the questions intended to measure social capital, and indeed religious practice, might have been phrased rather differently, and certainly with much greater awareness of the gendered differences in the way that Muslim men and women engage with places of worship. So ASMA's doctoral research is likely to lead us then to not only some very profound insights about the working and non-working lives of Muslim women in Britain, but I think also a very robust critique of some of the assumptions that underpin quantitative surveys that are directed towards Muslims and other religious minority groups. It's notable that many of the new generation of British Muslim social scientists are facing a set of questions and challenges in their fieldwork that could not have been predicted by their predecessors in the 80s and 90s. The impact of local, national and international events, and the desire to try to counterbalance undue negative framing of Islam and Muslims in the media has been an important motivating factor underpinning some recent doctoral projects that I've either supervised or examined. But some Muslim social scientists have brought to their work not only their scholarly and academic ambitions, but also the Islamic concept of niyyah, or intention. It's their intentions and their religious sincerity, alongside their relationships within British Muslim communities, that have usually enabled access to settings and organisations that are closed to the rest of us. But as an aside, we should not assume that the relative ease of access makes entry to the field any less complicated. Quite the contrary. Some Muslim social scientists have been concerned that their work is accomplished less by the official stamp of institutional ethical approval, and more by the blessings of a spiritual figurehead, who may in turn wish to exercise a right to test the intentions and the sincerity of the researcher. Acquiring the blessings of the sheikh or senior religious figure has the potential to be a far more testing process than the electronic submission of documents to an ethics committee. Similarly, Muslim social scientists conduct fieldwork within communities that are still strongly shaped by ideas about individual, family and collective honour. And they'll probably have to do quite a lot of soul searching about when, where and how to place the limits on what they reveal via research findings, especially where they wish to retain their membership of religious organisations or communities once their research is concluded, whilst also having academic rigour. So if British Muslim researchers are making new and interesting contributions to questions of method and fieldwork practice, alongside an expansion in terms of the topics and the kinds of research questions that are being asked, what about the theoretical potential arising from their work? I want to preface my answer to that question by saying that it's difficult for most Muslim social scientists to disregard epistemological and ontological assumptions that are shaped by their personal engagement with the Islamic tradition. Their understanding of religious phenomena is not confined to what can be measured, recorded or observed via interviews, observation, ethnography or focus groups, because their own experience is an intrinsic part on source in forming their work. In the Islamic paradigm, knowledge is located in the heart as well as in the mind, and this requires both interior and exterior reflection. It's a holistic enterprise that requires all the senses. Quranic injunctions towards interior reflection are easily accommodated within the principles of good social scientific fieldwork practice that now demand increasing attention to matters of ethics and reflexivity. So Muslim social scientists are bringing to the table a demand and a right to conduct research with alternative epistemologies and ontologies. Secular liberal assumptions that sometimes insist on disregard for the potential agency of the divine in order to have theoretical purchase risk the imposition of a hegemonic superiority that gives little space for other ways of seeing and understanding the world. There's certainly a sense among some of my graduate students in Cardiff that existing theories and concepts in the sociology of religion have some limits. If we bring to mind the fact that the founding scholars of the discipline have shaped their ideas within the context of European societies, largely in reference to Christianity and the influence of the Christian churches, there are sometimes consequences and limitations when Muslim social scientists endeavour to analyse their material within existing frameworks. To put it most starkly, Muslim worldviews generally depend upon reference to divinely revealed, non-negotiable truths derived from the Quran. This kind of worldview challenges assumptions in some quarters of social science about knowledge as relative, partial, contextually dependent, and socially constructed. For this reason, perhaps, there's been some interest among some of my students in Cardiff about the theory of Islamic critical realism, developed by Matthew Wilkinson from Cambridge Muslim College. Thank you. There isn't time to go into this theory in depth now, but the point to make is that Wilkinson has used ideas about critical realism proposed by the social theorist Roy Bhaskar and developed them in ways that can accommodate an Islamic worldview. Wilkinson is not prepared to jettison those matters of truth, capital T truth, that for him spring from a divine origin. Again, we can see him making some important bridges, this time in relation to social theory and theology, in ways that potentially broaden theoretical horizons. So, just as our fieldwork practices and theories benefit from the inclusion of a new generation of Muslim social scientists, it's likely that our collegial and professional associations will similarly benefit from their involvement in years to come. I'm sure that as they take up committee roles and responsibilities, they'll probably have an eye on the religious calendar. I remember when I was convener of the study group back in the late 1990s, Kieran Flanagan, who was the chair at the time, was absolutely insistent we could not have any study group events during Christian Holy Week. No way. And I suspect this may be the last conference that is organised to coincide with Ramadan. So I think an awareness of religious diversity within our professional associations is as important to consider as are the implications of religious diversity in society that we have tried so hard to document in our research. Since the early study of Muslims in Britain in the 70s and 80s, the new involvement of Muslim sociologists is generating a body of fresh and original knowledge about the everyday lives and worldviews of Muslims whose identities, beliefs and practices are in danger of being caught up in the tangle between discourses about radicalisation on the one hand and Islamophobia on the other. This new generation of scholars are making decisions about what is interesting and important to study, and their choices are different to those made by social scientists of Islam back in the 80s and 90s. Where there has been a tendency to study the external, institutional and visible manifestations and dimensions of being a Muslim, we can see that the tide is turning towards the internal, the non-institutional and the less visible dimensions. We can see the change in emphasis in the shift in focus that's taking place around the study of mosques, for example, where John Eade, Richard Gale and others did pioneering work in the 1990s and early 2000s to document the establishment of mosques in Britain, with a focus on planning and urban geography. Another of my PhD students who spoke yesterday, Abdulazim Ahmed, is looking at the internal life of his own mosque in Cardiff. As the ethnographer Tom Hall and Abdulazim's co-supervisor with me has noted, it's a shift from mosques in space to space in mosques. It's become very catchy, hasn't it, in our conversations? But with this shift comes some important implications for breaking down binary distinctions between sacred and secular, insider and outsider, public and private, and the internal and external aspects of religion. An ethnographic study of a mosque, conducted by a Muslim who has a long and sustained involvement with it over many years, renders these concepts at the very least complicated, if not potentially redundant. Theoretically, the involvement of a new generation of British Muslim social scientists furthers considerably the existing debate about ways of studying, writing and representing Islam. There are well-argued accounts of the problems that adhere to various ethnographic and literary accounts of Islam and Muslims, which tend to reflect the historically unequal relationship between Muslim-majority societies and the West. Bloomsbury very kindly lent me this prop. I promised I would give it back at the end. But in this new book, The Politics of Writing Islam, Mahmoud Mutman argues for the development of new perceptions of the tradition as open, heterogeneous, interpretive, multiple and dynamic. But he makes his argument almost entirely in relation to critical theory and on the basis of studies of Islam and Muslims in Muslim-majority societies. In the light of an emerging generation of Muslim social scientists based here, not there, there's clear scope for them to inject important new perspectives into these kinds of theoretical discussions. And I think that this new generation have a central role to play in conveying the sense of Islam as living, embodied tradition that's changing and developing in a dynamic relationship to the society in which it's based. But why does all this matter for the sociology of religion? What's the significance of this new work going on amongst a new generation of Muslim social scientists? So I want to move into the third and final part now to try to answer that question. In her paper at the close of the Religion and Society Programme conference in Cambridge in September 2012, Linda Woodhead, our very own Linda Woodhead, made a distinction between what she called old-style religion and new-style religion. To summarise, old-style religion is mediated through medium-sized neighbourhood organisations, gives little voice or choice to members, and has organisational uniformity. Relationships are generally superficial, and there's a reliance upon printed media, canons and creeds, all of which are mediated by a hierarchy of religious authority. In contrast, she'll identify new-style religion as offering greater intimacy and choice. It's informal and spontaneous. There are fewer assumptions about conformity, and there are associated benefits, such as sociability and entertainment. This is religious engagement that is about finding oneself, not losing oneself, and depends upon proactive choice. I found this distinction between old and new-style religion interesting and helpful for my own understanding of religious change in Britain. However, I fell into the trap of seeing these categorisations between old and new as somehow separate, clear and neatly bounded distinctions, which I'm not sure that they are, and it's probably not the way that Linda intended them to be understood. It's through my recent experience of supervising and examining a number of PhD projects about Muslims and Islam in Britain that I've come to appreciate that even within the same conservative religious movements or congregations, old and new styles of religious engagement can intersect and coexist with one another simultaneously, often in unexpected ways. At the individual level, the old and new styles can jostle with one another alongside mundane and, dare I say it, secular concerns. For example, there may be times in our lives when we appreciate the tradition and familiarity of old-style religion in terms of the way that it might connect us with heritage, ancestors or place. Meanwhile, for other kinds of religious or spiritual need, we may value new-style religion, where it offers informality, sociability and intimacy. There was a very memorable phrase that came out of our research at Cardiff about the religious nurture of Muslim children. And it's another of the projects conducted under the auspices of the Religion Society programme. The comment was from a mother in response to a set of questions about Cardiff as a place to bring up children. She said that Cardiff was a great place to be a Muslim because it was both big enough and small enough. We interpreted that observation as being about the range of Islamic organisations on offer in Cardiff and an ability to exercise choice. But our observation can be understood also as being a commentary not only about scale, but about the possibility that successful religious organisations in the marketplace have to be both old enough and new enough to meet the religious interests of different generations, different genders, and individuals with different levels of commitment. Some of you will have heard Riaz Timol's paper yesterday, which was based on his doctoral research about the Tablighi Jamaat movement in Britain. It seems to be a very good example of a religious movement that combines aspects of both old style and new style religion simultaneously. It's old enough to retain the traditional practices, textual focus, and conservative, authoritative norms familiar to older first-generation South Asian Muslims, and yet it's new enough to accommodate the interests of younger British-born Muslims who appear to exercise a far greater degree of choice and agency about when and how they engage with the movement. Youngsters might take part in sometimes very conservative and traditional practices, but in modern and very individualistic ways, and at times of their own choosing and convenience. They're willing to submit to authority here and now, but not always there and then. In other words, the TJ is old enough and new enough to meet the religious needs of different generations with varying levels of commitment. Through my experience of supervising the particular project, I've come to recognise that when it comes to thinking about old style and new style religion, it's not perhaps a matter of either or, but of both and. Linda illustrated her discussion of old style and new style religion with contrasting images of Christian religious activities. Church worship, with a congregation standing in rows, singing from a hymn book, conveyed the sense of old style religion, while a group of young people sitting informally at a Christian festival, I think it was Greenbelt, gave us a sense of new style religion. I don't have any images which convey the way in which the Tablighi Jamaat movement combines old style and new style religion, but Riaz might have some at some point. But a poster that came attached to an email message that I received recently from one of the mosques in Cardiff serves as quite a useful illustration of the general point that I'm trying to make. We know that halakas are a very traditional form of Islamic learning, but at this mosque in Cardiff, there's a seamless move from sitting in a circle and reading the Quran to playing football with your friends. In his recent book, The Many Altars of Modernity, Peter Berger explains that the coexistence of religious and secular discourses in society is mapped within the minds of individuals as well. If differentiation has occurred between religious and other institutions in society, this differentiation must also be manifested in the consciousness of individuals as well. In other words, even the most committed religious believer will nevertheless go through life with references to secular discourses as well. He says, and I quote, "For most believers, there's not a stark either-or dichotomy between faith and secularity, but rather a fluid construction of both and." It seems to me then that some of the most successful religious organisations in terms of attracting and retaining members are perhaps those that can mirror the differentiation in society and the fluidity between secular and religious discourses within our consciousness, with infrastructures and services to match. A religious organisation that can offer its members a range of provision can upscale, downscale, or juxtapose its activities as and when required, has potential scope to attend to religious aspirations as well as more mundane interests. The ability to offer the amenities of the department store, choice, anonymity, tradition, but on the scale of the corner shop, implying relationship, convenience and good neighbourliness, all of which are communicated by a range of modes and media, seem to be some of the critical hallmarks of flourishing religious organisations. So I've learnt a lot from this new generation of British Muslim social scientists, and it'll be for them to kind of unpack their findings and take the debate forward in the future. But I can already anticipate the potential explanatory power of research about Muslims in Britain for the wider sociology of religion. I think it's really important for researchers from a range of backgrounds, religious and academic backgrounds, to try to map the changes going on within British Muslim communities, because although Muslims only constitute about 5% of the population at the moment, their demographic trajectory is such that this figure of 5% is going to rise substantially in the coming years. And there's been some analysis and discussion about David Voas's analysis from the MCB report, looking at the changes between the 2001 and the 2011 census, and he predicts by about the middle of the century about 10% of the population in the UK will be of Muslim heritage. What that will mean in terms of belief and practice, we don't know, but that's his prediction. In other words, what goes on in relation to the likely increase in the self-identifying population of Muslim communities in Britain, probably other parts of Europe as well, is going to make an increasing contribution to the overall shape of religion in society. Not only are the number of Muslims likely to grow, but Asma Khan's analysis of the MBES dataset, to which I've already referred, is confirming a much earlier finding by Tariq Madood from the 1990s about the degree to which Muslims regard their religious identity and practice as important or very important in their lives. This means that the theories and ideas about religion derived from studies of Muslims in Britain could have significant things to say about patterns of religious change more widely. These studies might act as a catalyst for thinking afresh about research methodologies. And it's possible that study of Muslims in Britain could stimulate social and cultural theorists to interrogate more deeply the explanatory power of their theories in relation to changing religious trends, worldviews and practices.